In 1595, 4 ships left Amsterdam for the Spice Islands. 3 of them came back 2 years later. Of the 249 men who sailed out, fewer than 90 were still alive to see it. The spice in the holds barely covered what the voyage had cost. A profit, technically, on paper. The merchants who funded it called it a success. For most of the 16th century, the Dutch had built one of the most profitable commercial operations in Europe without controlling the source of anything. The Portuguese found the sea route to the Moluccas, extracted the nutmeg and the cloves and the pepper, and sold it in Lisbon. The Dutch sailed their flyboats, broad, flat-bottomed cargo ships built for bulk freight, south to Lisbon, bought it in bulk, and carried it north to Antwerp, to Hamburg, to London. Redistribution. They were the middlemen of the middlemen, and for a long time that was enough. Amsterdam got rich not by controlling what anything was worth, but by being the most efficient mover of everything. Then, in 1580, Philip II of Spain inherited the Portuguese crown. 2 empires, the largest maritime powers in the world, merged under one monarch. Philip was at open war with the Dutch Republic. He closed Lisbon to Dutch ships. The redistribution trade that had built Amsterdam's wealth ended almost overnight. Not gradually, overnight.
This wasn't a trade dispute, it was a weapon. The Dutch had been fighting Spain for their independence since 1568, a Protestant merchant republic against the largest Catholic empire in the world. When Philip closed Lisbon, he wasn't making a commercial decision. He was trying to starve a rebellion. For Amsterdam, the commercial crisis and the survival crisis were the same thing. What came next wasn't patient commercial planning, it was a scramble, and it started with a piece of intelligence that one man had spent years stealing.
Jan Hein van Linschoten had spent years in the Portuguese colonial service in Goa. He copied everything he could get his hands on, the charts, the sea routes, the harbor depths. The Portuguese had guarded that knowledge for nearly a century as a state secret. In 1595, Linschoten published it in Amsterdam. The intelligence was now available to anyone who could read Dutch. A consortium of Amsterdam merchants, 9 men, calling themselves the Compagnie van Ver, the Company of Far Places, pooled enough capital to outfit 4 ships. For fleet commander, they appointed a man named Cornelis de Houtman. Some accounts place him in Lisbon in the years before the voyage, detained there while gathering Portuguese intelligence under circumstances Lisbon would have considered espionage. He was not a leader of men, he was a man who knew things. And in the spring of 1595, that was what the merchants needed most. The route south was the only route there was. Down the full length of the Atlantic, hugging the African coast, then around the Cape of Good Hope at Africa's southern tip. The Portuguese had originally called it the Cape of Storms and earned the name. Ships there could build to 30 meters. Ships were regularly lost rounding it. Then weeks of open ocean across the Indian Ocean, navigating past Portuguese-controlled Goa on the Indian coast before the islands of what is now Indonesia finally came into range. The fleet spent more than a year just reaching Java. Java was not the destination. The Banda Islands, where the nutmeg actually grew, lay another 1,000 kilometers east. What de Houtman encountered on Java revealed the distance between knowing a route and commanding an expedition. Banten, at the northwestern tip of the island, the first major trading port they reached, a busy pepper market near what is today Jakarta, ended in violence with the local sultan's forces. He worked east along the northern coast and it got worse. A Javanese attack at Sidayu killed 12 of his men, and at Madura, a small island off the northeastern shore near Surabaya, his own crew killed a local ruler outright. He never reached the Banda Islands. By the time the fleet turned for home, disease had thinned crews so badly that one of the 4 ships, the Amsterdam, had to be stripped and burned on a beach at Bowian Island. There weren't enough survivors left to sail it. The 3 that remained limped into Amsterdam harbor in August 1597, 28 months after they'd left. Within a year, 5 more expeditions had left for the East Indies. The route was proven, and now everyone knew it. By 1602, roughly 14 separate Dutch companies were racing east simultaneously. Rotterdam merchants, Zeeland merchants, Hoorn, Enkhuizen, Delft. They were all after the same things: pepper in enormous quantities from the ports of Banten and Sumatra, the bulk commodity that moved by shipload; nutmeg and mace from the Banda Islands; cloves from Ternate and Tidore, further north in the Maluku chain. They carried European silver east, which was the currency Asian merchants actually wanted, and picked up Indian textiles along the way to trade deeper into the archipelago. The roots were there. The problem was 14 versions of the same company trying to work them at the same time. Picture a Dutch factor in a Javanese port, there to buy pepper. Across the same dock is another Dutch factor from a different company, there for the same cargo. The Javanese merchant knows he has 2 Dutch buyers. He plays them against each other. The price goes up. Multiply that scene across every port in the archipelago: Banten, Banda, Ternate. Every Dutch company bidding against every other at the source, driving purchase costs higher with each competing offer. Meanwhile, back in Amsterdam, 14 ships were arriving loaded with pepper from multiple directions, flooding the markets simultaneously. The price a merchant could charge in Europe collapsed under the weight of his own countrymen's supply. Paying more in Asia, selling less in Europe. The mathematics of ruin running in both directions at once.
The trap was that no single company could stop. Every merchant who pulled back handed the advantage to the 14 who didn't. You can't negotiate your way out of a race when everyone at the table is better off if the others quit. The only exit was someone outside the room with the authority to end it by force.
That man was Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the advocate of Holland, chief minister of the Dutch Republic's most powerful province, and the man with the most sway over the States General, the assembly of provincial delegates that served as the Republic's governing body. He's the architect almost no popular history remembers, and the same man the Republic would execute for treason 17 years later. In 1602, though, his authority was absolute. He put the competing companies in front of a single choice. The States General was chartering one unified trading company and granting it an exclusive monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. Every company that folded its capital in would have a proportional stake in that monopoly. Every company that didn't would be left outside it, still competing against each other, and now against a legally protected entity with rights they didn't have. It was not an invitation. It was a compulsion dressed as an offer. What the charter created was something that had never existed before: a single unified company with a 21-year monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. And the powers written into it went far beyond commerce: the right to build fortresses and garrison them, to raise standing armies, to conclude treaties with foreign rulers in the name of the Dutch Republic itself, to mint currency, to operate civil and criminal courts. the States General had outsourced the eastern half of Dutch foreign policy to a board of merchants. It was not a trading company with government backing. It was a sovereign power constituted as a company. They called it the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the United East India Company, the VOC. The money that built it came from more than 1,800 individual subscribers spread across the 6 chambers. At the top end, wealthy Amsterdam merchants putting in tens of thousands of guilders. At the other end, among the first 358 shareholders were small merchants and tradesmen willing to risk the minimum, 3,000 guilders, about £500 sterling at the time. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly £160,000 today, or $195,000, something like 10 years' wages for a skilled craftsman. Not cheap, but it put a stake in the company within reach of far more than the city's wealthiest families. For the first time, an enterprise of this scale was being funded not by a handful of powerful men, but by a broad cross-section of Dutch merchant society, pooling capital from 6 cities into a single institution. What each of them received in return was a certificate, a piece of paper representing their fractional stake in what had just been created.
And every one of them, from the largest Amsterdam merchant to the smallest tradesman who'd scraped together 3,000 guilders, had no say in how the company was run. They could not vote on dividends, could not audit the books, could not demand their money back. What they could do was sell their certificate to someone else, which is how the Amsterdam Bourse became the first real stock exchange, not a market for commodities, but for fractional ownership of an ongoing enterprise. You weren't buying into a voyage. You were buying into a company that might run dozens of voyages over the next decade in places you'd never go, making decisions you'd never see. The shareholders' connection to what the VOC actually did with those sovereign powers was severed from the moment the ink dried.
The board that controlled everything was the Heren 17 directors. 8 seats went to Amsterdam, which had contributed the most capital. 9 were divided among the smaller chambers. The 17th rotated, which kept Amsterdam from ever holding an outright majority. A deliberate balance of power inside the company that kept all of it away from the investors outside it. A board with absolute control over a company funded by 1,800 people who had no mechanism to question that control. It didn't take long for that gap to show itself, and no one exposed it more completely than Isaac Maire. Born in Tournai, he'd already built one of the great fortunes in Amsterdam through the Baltic trade. Grain, timber, the bulk commerce that moved northern Europe long before spices did. By the time the VOC was chartered in 1602, he was one of the wealthiest merchants in the city, and he put in enough capital to become its single largest individual shareholder, roughly 1/9 of all shares outstanding. He sat on the Amsterdam Chamber's directorate. He was not a passive investor watching from outside. He was one of the men who built the institution. What soured the relationship was money, specifically when it arrived and in what form. The Heren 17 paid dividends when they chose to, not on any fixed schedule, and in the company's early years, some of those dividends came not in cash but in spices, handed to shareholders to sell themselves, illiquid and worth less than the cash equivalent. Maire had poured a fortune into the company and found that the only legitimate way to see a return on it was waiting for 17 directors to decide he'd earned one. So, around 1605, he started trading privately, on his own account, in the same territories the VOC operated in.
And this is not the same thing as an investor competing with a company he happens to own stock in. Maire wasn't a shareholder moonlighting in the same industry. He was a sitting director, which meant he had the boardroom's own intelligence, prices out of Asian ports, trade contacts, supply conditions, the company's commercial plans,
and he was using it to trade privately in the same markets, potentially routing his best opportunities away from the company whose secrets he held.
And the VOC didn't just fine him or quietly ease him off the board. They expelled him from the directorate and banned him from trading in Asia entirely. Not censured, exiled. A man who had helped found an institution with its own armies, its own courts, its own currency, who held 1/9 of its shares, was told by the institution he'd built that he can no longer operate in the territory his money had helped conquer.
Maire organized a group of investors to sell VOC shares they didn't own, borrow the shares, sell them, wait for the price to fall, buy them back cheaper, keep the difference. Short selling in 1609 for the first time in financial history, while he spread word talking the company's prospects down himself, one furious founder trying to burn down the institution he'd helped build. Within a year, the Huron 17 had persuaded the States General to ban short selling outright, and Maire's campaign failed to break the stock. But 4 centuries later, markets everywhere still use what he invented.
In Amsterdam, the wider shareholder base barely blinked. One exiled director's private war with the board wasn't enough to shake confidence in the company itself. The ships were still sailing, the spice was still moving. What the Huron 17 were focused on was something far more immediate. The Banda Islands, 10 small volcanic islands in the Banda Sea in what is now eastern Indonesia, the only place in the world where nutmeg grew naturally. Not a market in nutmeg, the source itself. Control those islands, and you control the entire global supply of the most valuable spice on Earth. And those islands were home to roughly 15,000 people who had been trading their nutmeg with Chinese and Arab and Javanese merchants for generations, who understood exactly what their geography was worth, and who had very specific ideas about the terms on which they would trade it. The VOC Charter, the armies, the courts, the treaty powers, had been built with exactly this problem in mind, even if the shareholders thought they were buying into a trading company. The man who would eventually understand what solving that problem actually required was, in 1602, 15 years old. He was living in Hoorn, the small North Sea port where the VOC had one of its chambers. His name was Pieterszoon Coen. He was learning double-entry bookkeeping.
He came up through the accounts, not as a soldier, not as a ship's captain. He learned how to make the numbers balance before he ever learned what it would cost to make them balance.
He joined the VOC in 1607, aged 20 as a junior merchant. What the company saw in him over the next decade, in his letters to the head in 17, in the precision and the absence of sentiment with which he described what he believed would be necessary, was exactly what a structure like this had been built to find. The question his career leaves open is whether the VOC made him into what he became, or simply recognized him. The VOC needed the Banda Islands. The Banda Islands had 15,000 people who had no intention of giving them up. This is Pulse, Origins, produced by Singularity Pulse Network. Views expressed are our own. New episodes every Sunday. Follow us on @ThePulseSPN on X, the Everything app.
I'm Knox. Every Saturday on Pulse Deep Dive, one story told in acts. This season, how AI happened, who really invented the internet, and going back to the moon 53 years later. New chapter every Saturday. Find it wherever you listen.